Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
I grew up with the Book of Esther. I dressed as Queen Esther for Purim. I went to synagogue. I shook my grogger. I ate a lot of candy. I did all the things Jewish kids do on Purim. And I also studied it to some extent. And we learned certain things about the Book of Esther. Esther was the heroine. She was the heroine for the particularly feminine way she manipulated power, although that wasn't the way it was presented to me in Jewish day school. Mordechai was this great figure of communal leadership. Haman was Amalek, who had to be destroyed because he was an eternal enemy of Israel. And Vashti was an image of the proud woman. And I didn't really think about it that much until I got a little bit older. And then I started to have the thoughts that most adults, I think, have when confronted with the Book of Esther, even before I was teaching Bible, which is, this story ends in a genocide. That's a little troubling. Why do we dress up? Why is this great time of fun for us when really it's about killing, ultimately? Even though it's celebrating our survival, it comes at the expense of other people getting killed. And that's troubling. And then when I started thinking about stories of women in the Bible, which is something I had been interested in for a long time anyway, it occurred to me that there is another story to be told here that no one had ever spoken about. The most I had heard about Zeresh, Haman's wife, was that we hissed when her name was mentioned. So, we made lots of noise to blot out Haman's name. And then when Zeresh's name was read at synagogue, everybody went, which of course is also very gendered. It's the sound of the women's section in a lot of ways. And I hadn't really thought about her that much, but then it kind of occurred to me that there's more to her than we'd been led to believe. So the way I write is I think about the many things that I know about a character or about a book, in this case, the Book of Esther. And I usually home in on one passage or one episode that clarifies for me what the starting point is. So this is the passage that clarifies Zeresh for me. There, Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had befallen him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordechai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin." So as we see here, it says both his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him. But I began to think, what if it was only Zeresh who said it? Which means that she had an understanding of the situation that no one else had. What does it mean to understand the end game before it comes? That is, in some ways, if you start to think about it from within the person's experience, terrifying. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was the very end of the Book of Esther, where, Esther has arranged for Haman's downfall. And when you're in synagogue, Haman and his sons are hanged. And the tradition is that the reader reads those 10 names in one breath. And they are really complicated names. But to read them in one breath is quite a feat. But what it doesn't say is that Zeresh was killed. Now, the Midrash comes along and proposes that she was, or at least one of the Midrashim proposes that she was killed. But it's not in the text. So I started to think about, from the perspective of a mother and a wife, what would it mean to have my husband and all my sons, I don't have any sons, incidentally, but were I Zeresh, my husband and all my sons killed, and I'm left alive. And then it occurred to me that that is the great tragedy here. Because even if we accept that Zeresh is complicit in her husband's actions, she has to live with that loss. And that, to me, is overwhelmingly tragic. So I wrote out of that understanding of the character. You know, one of the things about writing about the Bible is that I always know how the end goes. You know, when you're writing a short story or a novel, sometimes you don't know the ending at the beginning. Sort of have to see where the character takes you. But if you're writing based on the Bible, you always know what the end is. And so I knew what the end of this story was. And the end of this story is Zeresh is alive and her entire family is dead. We don't tend to put ourselves into the feet or the experiences of the villain. We're not trained to do it. We're not inclined to do it. And with a character like Zeresh, she is positioned as a villain right from the start. Even in a book like Esther, which is not actually that serious a book. It's got elements of satire. It's got elements of farce. It really is unlike the rest of the Bible in a lot of ways. So once you decide that this book is a tragedy, you are really going to deviate from that way of storytelling. And I understood that, and it kind of hurt me to let go of those elements, but I understood that that wasn't the story I was telling. So once I put myself into her shoes, I really had to show that balance of her complicity and the real feeling of her downfall. Now, the other thing that animated this story, interestingly enough, is Ruth Madoff. So you'll remember Bernie Madoff, who pulled off, I think to date still, the greatest Ponzi scheme that we know of. He was a villain. He was a bad man who destroyed a lot of lives. And I remembered when he was taken down, there was a lot of talk about his wife. People said, she must have known. She's as bad as he is. Now, I grew up in New York around a lot of people who work in finance and a lot of women like Ruth Madoff. She's not at all a sympathetic person. If you watch interviews of hers, she comes off as entitled and self-absorbed and not particularly bright. But having grown up in that world, I can say with full confidence, she did not know what he was doing because the door was closed to her. So she got the benefit of all his misdeeds, for sure. But people wanted to say that she was complicit in a much more active way than I believe she was. And I was fascinated by that character, by the character who is given all the benefits of such villainy and really comes to believe that she deserves it on some level, but has no access to the inner sanctum in which things happen. And I tried to write a story about Ruth Madoff. I couldn't do it. I couldn't really create a character like Ruth Madoff. And I do think that Zeresh, both my Zeresh and the Zeresh in the original text, is a very smart woman. But at a certain point, the door is closed in her face because she still lives in a world in which she can only be an advisor at home. She doesn't have access to the actual seat of power because she's a woman. She's a wife. So she can be smarter than her husband. And I think both in the book of Esther in the Bible and in the creation of my imagination, she is smarter than Haman. But he has to do the work. She can't do it. She can say, this is what you should do. And then he has to go and do it. He has to essentially buy his way into power, which is both what the book of Esther shows us and what I made much clearer, is that what it meant to be a counselor of the king meant you furnished him money so that he could, buy his palaces and conduct his wars. And I mean, it's like donors to political parties now. You buy influence. And that's what the Persian court was, from what I understand, in reality and also in my imagination. One of the things that I came to understand in teaching that course on Bible is more about the ways in which the Persian Empire functioned. So the Persian sultan, king, emperor, whatever he was called at any given time, had spies who fanned out across the empire to make sure that people were loyal to him. And I wanted to incorporate that element into the story because I thought that it indicated something about the background of this narrative that is lost when we only read it from a religious perspective. That's the same reason why I made it clear that the killing of the sons of Haman really isn't because of anything they did. It's because of an idea of collective punishment. When Haman tries to wipe out the Jews, it's not because every single Jew did something bad. It's because there's an idea of clannishness at work. Mordechai's entire clan had to be killed because of what Mordechai did. So when Mordechai becomes the person in a position of power, Haman's entire clan, in his case, his family, has to be killed. So it really doesn't matter if other people are innocent or guilty. What matters is this is how punishment is meted out. And that is true to the end of the story when there is that rampaging genocide. So I wanted to get the spy in, the eunuchs, who are very important to the story of Esther in the Bible. And eunuchs appear here and there in the rest of the biblical canon, but the eunuch as a figure is not that present. But in the book of Esther, eunuchs are important. So I wanted those characters to be more present, also because it sets the setting of the Persian Empire apart a little bit from our imagined understanding of the earlier Canaanite setting of the rest of the text. By text, I mean the biblical text here. We have art from the Persian Empire, and I wanted to incorporate ideas of aesthetics that we see in those artistic renderings, the use of color and pattern, the way human figures are drawn. So I tried, to the best of my ability, to make Vashti, who's considered the most beautiful woman in the land, really look like what I see in those depictions. And so having Mordechai be a spy for the king, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes is the king they usually pin Ahasuerus to, it gives him a reason for all of his actions. And it gives Haman a reason to hate him. So one of the things about writing anything, any piece of fiction or nonfiction even, is that every character has to have his or her internal motivation, something that drives them to want to get what they want. So for Zeresh, it's to rise in the political society. She wants a seat at the table. She wants to open the door that she is locked behind. And the only way she can do it, as capable as she is, I mean, she runs the business. And that too was based in Persian, ancient Near Eastern practice, where women did run the business. It wasn't like women really just sat at home, as in Greek society, where women were not allowed out of the house. Women were capable. They ran the family farms. They dealt with the merchants, but they couldn't have a seat at the king's table. They couldn't become the counselors. They couldn't control the treasury. So the only way she could rise like that is through her husband. Now, her husband wanted the same thing. He wanted to be the right-hand man of the king, but he needed her guidance because he's a fool. And the truth is, I think he's a fool in the original text as well. He's vainglorious. He's caught up in his own image. He can't get out of his own way. But she sees a lot more clearly. And maybe she sees more clearly because she has a little bit of distance from the center of power. Still, she's blinded by her own desires. And, the thing about tragedy that we learned from Shakespeare and others is that a person has to be brought down by her own desires, by her own faults. Otherwise, it's not a tragedy. So it's her actions that have to lead to her ultimate downfall. I thought maybe I'd read a little bit from the story. It's a part of the story that people have reacted to, and then afterwards I'll talk about it. The king's palace stood shining on the city's highest plateau, where it was visible from every precinct. She could see it ahead of her, becoming larger in her sight as she rode up and around to the back entrance. Guards stopped her at the gate, but when she pulled back her veil, they quickly allowed her to ride through. The palace grounds lay still. She never knew how they did it. Even after 6 nights of feasting, every noble and rich man in the province invited to drink himself into a stupor and then led to sleep it off somewhere in the side houses' many apartments, the grass was even and full. No twig hung broken from a tree. The flowers grew tall and riotous. As many times as she had passed through, she had never seen a man take a tool to hand. No gardeners bent over in toil. Perhaps, she thought, the king really is the son of the Creator. Maybe he sends his angels to smooth over the ground at night so as not to bother the people within. Silly thoughts, even if they helped calm her nerves. She shook them off by the time she reached the women's building and descended from her horse to the ground. Even here, where everything spread out like a field of gems, the soil lay ashy beneath her slipper, and beneath that was the winter's wet earth. The eunuch who pulled back the heavy door smiled brightly when he saw who it was. He smiled even more when she pressed a small gold-edged mirror into his hand. They were always happy to see her here. He led her quietly through rooms filled with pretty young women, most of them placid-faced and bored, all the royal concubines anointed and painted for another day of waiting to see if the king would call them. He usually didn't, so they submitted themselves to the army of attendant eunuchs around them, and then had it all washed off when the night came. They'd wake in the morning to do it all over again. 3 nights before, all the aristocratic wives and daughters had feasted together, invited by the queen to celebrate their yearly return to Susa. The king was intent on celebrating for the entire week, but the queen had tired of the festivities. The women, she knew, needed to get back to their work. Households, fields, and tenant disputes wouldn't wait on them for 7 days, so she served the cakes and set them free. Let the men drink themselves stupid. Women had work to do. Zeresh walked through these familiar rooms, pressing small gifts into the hands of the eunuchs as she passed. The wooden walls hung with heavy drapery. Jewels inlay every possible surface. It was all as if to make up for the fact that these women, plucked out of obscurity when youth still rouged their cheeks, would never have husbands of their own. Her sister waited for her in the farthest room. As always, Zeresh was struck by her beauty. Long, regal nose above thick lips, black hair and hooded brown eyes that looked at everything as if from a distance no one could bridge. Zeresh shared every one of those features, but on her, they resulted in what others called handsomeness. On her sister, they took on the solidity of fact. Her radiance so obvious it had never occurred to Zeresh to feel jealous. Her sister's looks had been good for them all. Their father had found good marriages for them both. She had married a rich man who gave her many sons. Vashti became queen. So, Zeresh and Vashti are sisters. That's new. It's not in the original text at all. I made that up. That came straight out of my mind. It just seemed to make sense to me, to be honest. You know, what I like about that passage is that it really shows a lot of the different elements that came together for me to write this story. Now, the way I think about writing is that writers have to be kind of like magpies. We just collect little things here and there, and then we mix them up and lay them out in a new way. There's a bird called a bowerbird I'm really taken with. They're supposed to be very, very smart. And then during mating season, the male of the bird creates these bowers. So they take twigs and sticks, and some of them make little huts, little round huts, and others make corridors. And then they pick up stuff all over the place and they create these displays. Some of them group everything by color. So they'll take pieces of glass and shell and plastic. So the one pile will be orange and one pile will be red and one pile will be blue, or some of them only use one color. Some of them, they even use perspective. So they put smaller pieces at the front of their courtyard, and then the pieces get larger as they get closer to the bower. So it draws the female bird in. Writers are like bowerbirds, not for mating purposes, of course. Well, maybe some people are for mating purposes, not me. But we take these disparate things, the trash, really, and then we arrange them to draw people in. So this passage has all these things that I read about Persia, and all these things that I read in the Bible, and all these things that I read in scholarship, all put together, plus the central thing that I think a writer has to do to make something seem real is it has a relationship at the center of it. Zeresh doesn't have access to the king's quarters. She doesn't have access to the real center of power, but she has access to the queen. I'm not particularly interested in the character of Esther. I find Esther too predictable, and also maybe too known. I'm more interested in the characters we don't know than the characters we do know, although other people love Esther and go for it, that's great. But what the text of the book of Esther shows us is that from the harem, there can be avenues of influence. And so since I wasn't writing about Esther, since I was writing about pre-Esther, I had to find a way to show that Zeresh had avenues of influence other than just sending her husband to do the work that they needed to do to rise, because I have no story. One of the things about writing any sort of fiction is you have to have a protagonist who does things. If you have a protagonist who doesn't do things, then you don't really have a story. So Zeresh has to do things, and Zeresh also has to be able to go places. And one of the places has to be the king's house, the palace. So it made sense to me that Vashti and Zeresh would be sisters. It also makes sense for why Zeresh wants to rise so high, because her sister, after all, is queen. Shouldn't she be right there? And Vashti tells her straight out in the story, be happy with what you have. You don't you don't understand what it is to be so close to power. It's not all you think it is. And one of the things that I really like in the way we talk about the figure of Vashti is, for the entirety of my childhood, Vashti was just sort of the bad wife, as opposed to Esther, who was the good wife. But as you get older and you start to see this book in a more mature way and think about it in a more mature way, you realize that Vashti is a much more interesting character. And the commentaries talk about this, certainly feminist readings talk about this, that she was a woman who stood up for herself and she was punished for it. Whereas Esther never really stood up for herself. She was always doing something for somebody else, which took its own form of bravery. But the king never asked anything of Esther the way he asked something of Vashti. And Vashti, having been queen, would have known the consequences. But we also don't know what happened to Vashti. Just as Zeresh's story ends without a resolution, so Vashti's story ends without a resolution. What I was able to do at the end of this story is bring them back together. And then, they're going to live out their lives in punishment together, but they have each other. I, like most American readers, really love a happy ending. And it's really hard to give a character a happy ending in the Bible. There aren't so many of them. So at least I could give her comfort, Zeresh, after she had lost so much, everything. She lost everything. Her family, her home, her hopes, her ambitions, her sense of herself. And she had done it all. It had originated in her. And so she had to live with that because she wasn't killed. Getting killed is actually a way out of having to deal with all of the fallout. Hamlet doesn't have to deal with the fallout of all he's caused. He's, good night, sweet prince. But Zeresh really does, which in some ways, if you think about it, is often the woman's role. The woman is not caught up in the machinations of state. Women don't go off to war. The men go off to war and get killed, and then it's their mothers and sisters and wives and daughters who have to live without them. Well, Zeresh is the same. She has to live without everyone and everything she'd ever known and wanted. So at least let her have the comfort of her sister. And that's why Vashti and Zeresh are sisters.